Good evening and welcome to The Power of the Vote. On behalf of Richland Library, I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Crystal Johnson. I'm the manager of Richland Library Blythewood and a member of the library's African American History and Cultural Events Committee, the group that is hosting tonight's event. If you signed up early, you may have noticed that Judy Gatson was listed as the event's moderator, but Judy is not able to join us this evening. Tonight's moderator will be Don Frierson, host of The Urban Scene. Don and the panelists will tackle the topic of how African American and Latino votes may impact the upcoming November 3rd elections, as well as issues including voting eligibility, mail-in absentee voting, the implications of COVID-19, and the impact of the United States Postal Service funding crisis on voting options. Before I introduce you to our panelists and moderator, I do want to let you know of some current and upcoming opportunities at the library. If you are in need of an application to request an absentee ballot, or if you need a stamped voter registration form, you can pick those up at any of our drive-through locations. And that includes St. Andrews, Ballantyne, Sand Hills, or Northeast. Again, absentee ballot applications and stamped voter registration forms are available at our St. Andrews, Ballantyne, Sand Hills, and Northeast locations. On Thursday, October 22nd at 6:30 p.m., please come back and join us virtually for Mama Can You Hear Me? A Cry from the African American Soul with author-scholar Dorothy Roberts. Just visit our website at richlandlibrary.com and you may register there. Now, I'd like to introduce you to tonight's panelists. First, you will hear a moderated discussion with Dr. Miriam E. Torres. She is the Clinical Associate Professor and Director of the Consortium for Latino Immigration Studies at USC. And you will also have Dr. Todd Shaw. He is the Associate Professor of the Department of Political Science and African American Studies at USC. During the second half of the program, you will hear from Kel Carter. He is the Voter Outreach Coordinator of Richland County Elections and Voter Registration. We'll also have China Phillips. She's the chair of the 2020 Census Complete Count Committee for the City of Columbia. We'll have Tanya Rodriguez Hodges. She's the founder and executive director of Latino Communications Community Development, and Brandon Upson, who's executive director of Amplify Action. A little housekeeping, program attendees, I invite you to place any questions you have for the panelists in the chat box. There will be a few minutes at the end of the program for Don to select a few questions to be answered by the panelists. Again, program attendees, please use the chat box to submit questions. Any other features will not be used during the program tonight. Before we get started, I do want to remind you that Richland Library's vision is to enhance the quality of life for our entire community. By offering opportunities to learn, create, and share, people can become better informed, feel empowered, and fully participate in democracy. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in tonight's program are those of our guests and do not necessarily reflect the position of Richland Library, as our organization does not endorse any specific political or policy agendas. So without further ado, your moderator for The Power of the Vote is Mr. Don Frierson. He is the host of the Urban Scene radio broadcast, which is South Carolina's longest running talk and information forum for the African American community. So now, Don, Dr. Torres, and Dr. Shaw, thank you for being with us. I see most of your cameras are already on, so if you'll go ahead and unmute yourselves. Don, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be with you on this evening as we discuss the power of the vote, the Hispanic vote, and the African American vote. And hopefully at the end of the program, you will become much more knowledgeable about the vote and how these two entities will impact this presidential election. I would like to start with you, Dr. Torres. Could you explain the dichotomy of the Hispanic population and the Hispanic vote in these United States?
Thank you, Don. When we say the Latino or the Hispanic vote, that's big words, because we are not a homogeneous population. We are a very diverse population, and that is something that has a lot of impact in any election. And let me tell you why. Latinos or Hispanics became the largest minority in the United States in about the year 2000. And at this moment, the population is being born in the United States at a larger rate than growth by immigration. And that is why in this presidential election, we are, as the slideshow says, about 32 million potential voters among the Latino population. Now, who are we, Latinos? The majority of us are Mexican or Mexican American. It's about 62 to 65% of the population. And then we have people from Cuba, and then people from Puerto Rico, which, by the way, have been United States citizens starting in 1917. So basically, everybody that lives in the United States from Puerto Rico are US citizens, meaning they are not immigrants. Then we have other countries at a lower percentage. Those are the three largest groups. Now, how do we vote? It is very diverse too. Why? It depends, as with any other voter in the United States, our experiences play a big role at the time of voting. And so let me give you an example. When we, as Latinos, hear a political message saying this candidate or the other is going to make America a socialist country, there are people that have had very bad experiences in their own countries trying to be socialist or communist. So that's something that it is resonating with the population. Now, what we care about in a presidential election? We care about everything that every voter cares. We care about the economy. We care about, at this very moment, we are suffering a pandemic. And as you know, underrepresented populations like African Americans and Latinos are having a very hard time during this pandemic with COVID-19. And many of the issues are that we are essential workers, we are in the front line, and there are characteristics of poverty that are affecting us too. So we care about that too. We care about race relations too. We care about how the police is treating us and treating our brothers and sisters. So in in that, we are not much different than every person in the United States. Now, whether we go and vote or not, it is a big issue among us too, because throughout the years, we have not been treated well. So we've been waiting for immigration reform that many of us care about for years and years and years, and it is not happening. And so all these issues are what we think at the time of a presidential election.
Before I open it up to everyone, does the region a Hispanic comes from, does that dictate how they feel about policy in this country? I mean, if someone comes from Puerto Rico as opposed to Cuba, as opposed to Venezuela, how does that impact the Hispanic vote and how they look at politics in this country?
I like to say that we, as Latinos in general, many of us are very interested in politics. And we have opinions and we are involved. Now, where we come from, I think it matters. It matters because we have our experiences in our own countries. As I was mentioning earlier, seeing, for example, if you come from Cuba, people from Cuba have come to this country in different ways, meaning that if you get to the United States and you are from Cuba, you are basically embraced by the United States. But if you come from other countries, not so much. And those experiences, political experiences that we live in our own countries, play a role, because then we see that some regimes that are trying to be imposed in our countries may not be working, so we may be leaning towards not supporting someone who we think is going to go too much to the left, for example. Now, there is also a factor of disenfranchisement in our population, where we feel that our vote doesn't count. And that's very dangerous, in my opinion. So all these things, and yes, you are right, our backgrounds and our countries influence how we vote too.
Okay, thank you for that primer. I would like to invite all of our guests to come online now, if they can just unmute their videos and we'll get them on. All of our guests, if they could just unmute their videos and we will go ahead and get them on. But while we're waiting for our guests to come online, do you think most Hispanics realize the power they have with the vote, or is this just a new phenomenon that they're now beginning to grapple with? Again, we invite all our
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. If I know that Miriam probably agrees with me, or Dr. Torres probably agrees with me, they don't. We're talking about folks that have been expendable for so long. And then, as an example, let's just take COVID, okay? Let's just take COVID-19. They have been expendable for so long. And then they went from expendable in a particular box of expendableness, okay? They were told that they weren't welcome and how they needed to go back to wherever they came from, no matter what the situation was. And then they became essential workers. And then those essential workers became expendable in a way that nobody thought about. Expendable in that they were catching COVID or coming down with COVID, with the virus, taking it back to their families, dying, and no one was asking, hey, what about those Latinos that are working in our fields and working in our agriculture? No one was asking where their produce was coming from. No one was asking where their meats were coming from and how their shelves were continuing to be restocked. So no, that we don't understand the value and the power that we have behind the vote, which is why folks like Dr. Torres and people like Pasos and Latino Communications were out here trying to educate and get as many people registered to vote as possible so that they understand that every vote counts. Every single vote counts.
Antonia, I agree with you, of course, 100%. Sometimes we come from our own countries and the vote doesn't count there either. So we come with that, and that is, again, very dangerous because we need to vote. I know Tonya agrees with me that we are very involved politically because we know how important it is to help our people we elect accountable. And if we don't vote, there is not a possibility of doing that. And some of us, some of our, the people that come with us or that are here don't see that value. And the reasons that Tonya explained so well are very key. But also, as I said, our own experiences from our own countries where sometimes our vote didn't count either, or we thought it didn't count.
Dr. Shaw has joined us. Dr. Shaw, talk about the power of the Black vote in 2020.
Well, thank you, and it's great to join your panel and be speaking to everyone this evening. So the African American vote is critical, and I'm just saying something that many people already know, trying to articulate a truth that everyone knows. There are a lot of ways you could slice this. One way you could slice this question of the African American vote mattering, and this, a scholar by the name of Ron Walters did this many years ago, but some of this math still applies. Whereas he, in one of his books on Black presidential politics, looked at the number of African American unregistered voters and compared it to the vote margin for the candidates, particularly, I think it was back in the 1994 election, I believe he did, or 96, and found that that margin of the margin of victory for the individual who won in each of these sort of critical battleground states was smaller than the number of African American voters who were registered to vote. Similarly, if we looked at the 2016 election, the margin that of African Americans who were registered to vote, who were not registered to vote in states like Wisconsin, Minneapolis, Pennsylvania, were a larger margin than Donald Trump won. Well, I should say Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, a larger margin that Donald Trump won by, like 70,000 votes across various states, then again, that unregistered number. So just looking at the question of how the African American vote can be critical, and this is combined with the Latino vote, how these votes can be critical, often because African Americans are vote. And there's a real rationale why African Americans vote so solidly Democratic. Now, that doesn't mean African Americans only identify as Democrats strongly, or identify as Democrats at the same rate at which they vote in the direction of the party. There are many African Americans who claim independent, partly because they're not as satisfied at parts with the Democratic Party or Republican Party, who have moved even further away from aspects of concerns by African Americans. But it does mean that when it comes down to making that choice, that African Americans are a critical margin. I would argue to you, and everyone in the state of South Carolina knows this, that Joe Biden would not be the Democratic presidential nominee were it not for South Carolina, and particularly Black South Carolina voters, and most particularly African American women voters. So in all these ways, these are just a couple of key points I'll throw out there about how critical the African American vote is. One other way I'll slice this very, very quickly, I'm sorry, I'm taking a lot of time here, but one other way I'll slice this is that in 2012, you saw African American turnout at 66%. In 2016, it went down from 66%, where it was actually higher than white turnout, to 59%. And again, that's another reason. That's another way in which those margins determine as to whether or not the Democrat or Republican won. So these are all the ways that I can tell people what they already know about how the African American vote is critical.
I'm gonna throw this out to all of our panelists, and each one of you can take a crack at this. In what way is the African American and Hispanic population similar in terms of how it might affect their votes, and in what ways are they dissimilar? I'll throw that out. Anybody want to tackle that?
Yeah, this is Brandon Upson with Amplify Action, and I wanted to quickly touch on the similarities. I think there is a common distrust in the system. There's a common distrust in the system at large, being that when politicians come around, typically every 4 to 2 years, and try to get votes out of these communities, a lot of those promises that are made during that time are not followed up on. I've worked on electoral campaigns for the last 10 years, and I remember going out and knocking on doors in Beaufort, South Carolina, over in Dillon, South Carolina, you know, in our rural parts of the state, where people not only don't feel safe, but they don't see anything changing once they cast their ballot. So one of the similarities for me and the work that we do in Amplify Action with trying to register men is bridging and repairing those breaches of trust and letting them know how their issues connect to their voting habits for bringing solutions to their communities.
Anybody else want to tackle that?
So I think for Latinos, there is a large proportion of us that we care about immigration policies, and that we are hurt by words, like many people, but what is being said by the candidates. And I agree with what Brandon said, in the sense that sometimes we see the candidates coming to us and saying, "Hola, ¿cómo está?" And that's like, oh my God. But then nothing happens. And the situation is still the same, and there is no changes in immigration reform, for example. But I have to say too, that there are some of us who don't feel as offended by the words that are said about immigrants. And to me personally, it's a puzzle to see that and to hear that. And one of the things that is involved in there, for example, is religion. Many of us Latinos are Catholic, and sometimes when we see candidates talking, for example, about abortion, and some people feel very strongly that I'm not gonna vote, and it doesn't matter anything. There is nothing positive or even more negative about the platform. But if I hear that, I'm not gonna vote for that person. And that is critical for us. So in that sense, we are different among us.
When you talk about the power of the vote, the Black vote, the Hispanic vote, sometimes I think it's almost a competition to see which vote is more powerful, and therefore the candidates have to weigh how they approach each group. Do you get a sense of that? And I'll just throw that out to our audience. Dr. Shaw, I'll start with you first.
Yes, there may be this sense of competition, but more and more, I think within groups, there's an awareness of alliances, even though there are distinct differences. And let's keep in mind that when we use these broad categories, particularly Latina, Latino, that it is such a broad category of people from various nations that you're actually talking about individuals who, in our very very myopic way in the United States, can see themselves as ranging racially and ethnically. And so, sort of being Afro-Cuban, being, Afro-Puerto Rican, et cetera. So there are ways in which individuals check a lot of boxes or more than one box in their ethnic, national, and racial designations, and may feel they fit in more than one community. Having said this, I would say that I was actually reading a paper today where the author, who's a political scientist, talked about the ways in which there is a greater awareness, particularly from this 2016 election, of the sense of being people of color, that there are now African Americans at higher rates and Latinos at higher rates and Asian Americans at higher rates that have a sense of connection to the group more broadly. And some of that could be the fact that across all of these three groups, they are more likely to vote Democratic than their white counterparts. And so now, that's not to quash the diversity, but I think there is this awareness that when sort of these derogative notions are said about immigrants, how far is it, it's not exactly the case, but how far are we from it becoming a derogatory notion against individuals who are African American? So I think there's some awareness, although there's more that could be done.
I want to bring in K.L. Carter, who's the voter outreach coordinator for Richland County Elections and Voter Registration Office. Mr. Carter, I've been doing voter registration for a long time in my association with the NAACP. I can't ever recall a time when there's been a specific targeting of Hispanic citizens in South Carolina, actually, to register to vote. Is that changing?
Well, in terms of personal experience, it's changing slightly, but it's not changing at the rates that it is, say, for example, my home state of Texas. So, and I think it has to do primarily with population size as well as the people who are requesting voter outreach and voter registration outreach. Like, since I've been here, the vast majority of people who tend to request voter outreach and voter education, they tend to be African American, but they also tend to be African Americans, I would say, that are north of the age of 40. Like, so in fact, I want to say in all my times of doing outreach, there's only probably been a handful of occasions where there's been people who are below the age of 35 that have requested outreach or requested voter education. And in the case of outreach involving the Hispanic community, it's really only been 2 in my entire 2 years of being within Richland County Elections and Voter Registration. So I think as time goes on, it will increase. But again, I think it's based on a few various factors, because again, when you look at the subject overall, it tends to be a nuanced subject, in given South Carolina and as well as the population density and everything else, as well as you could say the organizations that are concerned about voting and concerned about getting specific groups out to vote, that pretty much in essence shapes who, shall we say, who requests for voting outreach, voter education, and information like that. So,
Ms. Rodriguez, are you seeing an uptick in voter registration projects designed for Hispanics?
So I'm glad you asked that question, because China is on the panel with us, and we just completed a tri-county event that happens last Saturday. And that's exactly what we did. It was North Charleston, Spartanburg, and Columbia. And we partnered with various organizations, including the Complete Count here in Columbia. China led that push here. And, you know, listen, if it's one person or two people, then that's two more people at the voting polls on November 2nd. But I will tell you that we got more. We had a great turnout in Columbia. We had great turnouts in the other two counties. And I am proud to say that it's not going to be the last one. It is the first time that Latino Communications ever tried this, because I know how important it is. And I realize how many people just did not understand that they had the right to vote. And it's not going to be the last time we do something like this.
China would be China Phillips. She's with the Census Bureau. How does the Census Bureau fit into the equation, Ms. Phillips, of what we're talking about today?
So Don, I will correct you there. I'm actually with the Sisters of Charity Foundation, and we love individuals all around us. And this is our local effort that we focus on for when it comes to policy. Because we understand that the census is just one piece of the puzzle and everything is connected. Something that Tanya just mentioned is the lack of understanding when it comes to what does the census even do? How is it impact me on a daily basis? And so what we have done is try to bring that into our strategy, Don. When we're out in the community, we make sure we go to them, we bring them with information, and we try to localize what we're doing, right? And we say that when you care, when you fill out the census, that means dollars to your community, that means resources. And then when they complain and they say, well, I don't see the resources, I don't see the dollars going to where I need it to, then that's when we begin to have a deeper conversation. And I say, all right, now it's time for you to get invested in who you're electing, right? And then ask the questions. Ask them, where's the money going? And then if the money is not going where you want it to go, guess what? It's time to put somebody else in that seat. We need to start having richer conversations that's authentic with the individuals that we claim to care about, which is our community, no matter where they come from, right? And then what's amazing, and I'll stop there.
You are the executive director, and you basically focus on political engagement for the African American male electorate. Why the African American male electorate, right? Not African Americans, period?
Yeah, because in 2017, with the special election of Doug Jones down in Alabama, seemed like the next day after that election, America woke up with an epiphany that Black folks vote. And not only do Black people vote, but Black women vote at a high level and help determine elections. So from that election, there were a lot of groups that came to be to invest in Black women and expanding that electorate and mobilizing it even more. But there wasn't the same emphasis or investment in doing that for Black men, which 9 out of 10 Black men vote for, particular candidate. And I'm sorry, I hope you didn't lose me here. But what we found was, looking at the numbers in the 2016 election, the number of unregistered and non-participating Black men in some of our southern states was a high multiple of the marginal loss that Hillary Clinton had in 2016. In South Carolina, that margin was 1.1 times her margin. In North Carolina, it was 3 times, and in Florida, it was 7 times. So what we saw is, if we could get Black men to participate at the same level as Black women, then we could get people elected who would fight for our I'm sorry, I'm on my phone and everybody's calling me. They see me now. Hey, everybody. Thank you for your support. But if we could get Black men to participate at the same level as Black women, we would be able to elect folks who champion policies that impact our communities at a higher level and be able to hold them accountable to our communities. And like I said earlier, one of the biggest issues that we have is that we have people who do not trust the system because the system has not proven itself to be trustworthy. So now we have to reacclimate people to let them know, and particularly Black men, because it's a tough group to convince, that their vote matters. And if they vote, that it can make a difference. So that is what we're working on, and we're seeing it done in great strides. Last month, we registered 8,100 Black men across the South. This month, we're focused on registering another 20,000, and we're going to do it.
Is that true in the Hispanic community also? And I've realized we're talking about a very diverse community.
Yeah.
But do Hispanic women tend to outvote Hispanic men based on what you've seen?
From what I've seen, you know, when God made women, he did a great thing. And if we could get our guys to participate at the same level as women do, we would see vast changes across our communities. My theory of change is that if we change the politics of the South, we can change the politics of America. And just by getting men, both Latinx and Black and African American descent men, to vote at the same level as women, we would see that change. And I say, if we change the politics of the South, we change the politics of America, because living in the South, we know that the craziest policies are birthed in our southern states, and then they spread out across the country from there. So yeah, we're seeing it across the board. Women outperforming men.
You care to comment on that, Ms. Rodriguez, Ms. Torres?
No, I just say that the Pew Research Center estimated that in 2016, 88,000 Latinos were eligible to vote. And I wouldn't be surprised that this year, more than 100,000 of us, we became a political power starting in 2008. So yeah, I don't have the data. I am not a political scientist, but I don't have the data by gender, but I wouldn't disagree with Brandon that women vote more than males.
I would disagree just slightly, only because we are seeing an uptick in men that are receiving the machismo of the Republican campaign, and this is being reported, and it's a clear uptick. It's very well reported in the Florida area that you have these men that are gravitating toward the Republican Party because they feel that they are being spoken to directly. Now, what is a part of this phenomenon that is happening? You have someone repeating the same thing over and over again to men that appreciate the, I don't know if you can translate this in sign language, but machismo of that feeds into what our men like, okay? They like to be stroked and told that they're wonderful and told that they're great. And that's what they're being fed day in and day out. So you have this uptick happening in Florida, and I believe it will continue to happen. I have a 94-year-old father who is loving this type of talk, right? So that it surprises me, but yet at the same time, it doesn't surprise me, right? Because typically it is the women that lead the family to make these bigger decisions in the household.
And can I add, so the research that we found showed that African American women voted at 64% in 2016, and then African American men voted at 59% in 2016. And with that uptick that you described that's happening in Florida, in our southern states, my theory for it is whatever you invest in, you will reap from, right? So you'll see growth in whatever you invest in. Traditionally, there has not been a strong investment in African American and Black men to turn them out in large numbers for elections. And what we're seeing now is that the Republican Party and their candidates are investing in outreach to African American men and Latinx men because there is that big gap in trust. You can take advantage of that and say, all right, you don't trust the system as it is. You don't trust the status quo. Our guys are anti-status quo. Our guys are not a part of the system. They are the outsiders. Vote for them because they will, speak the truth and shame the devil, as my mom would say, right? But we know that in many cases, that rhetoric is contradictory to what the reality is. So it's investment that's making that number tick up, not just a natural flow and order of things. And if we want to see these populations grow and participate in higher rates, then we have to make those same investments and go on the ground and meet them where they are. The only reason we were able to register 8,100 Black men last month wasn't because we set up a table at an event and waited for them to come to us. We actually found and purchased the data for their home addresses, cell phone numbers, email addresses, and went after them with a message, had a conversation, and got them registered across 4 states. That's the work that needs to happen. You're not going to be able to do this behind a swivel chair. You're going to have to put your boots on the ground and do it in a safe way with the COVID pandemic. But it doesn't negate the fact that we have work to do.
That's very interesting. Let me throw this out to you. And this is a statistic I came across this afternoon, and I thought it was very interesting. And it goes directly to what you said. And Dr. Shaw, if you can comment on this. Black men and Hispanic men are more supportive of Trump than Hispanic women, than Black women and Hispanic women. I just thought that was interesting without actually commenting on who you're going to vote for. I just thought that was very interesting. You have any thoughts on that, Dr. Shaw?
Yes, I mean, I think, well, that's a relative number, and you have to kind of drill down to say, well, what is that actual percentage? So to your point, Don, there was this discussion about that 13% of African-American men voted for candidate Trump back in 2016. If we heard 13% from any other group, we would say, well, that's not a very large percentage, right? And so I think it's the presumption that we have that individuals are naturally going to vote for one party or the other. I do think that there is, now, one thing I would caution people about in some of these numbers is it's not just elections, and even sometimes polls polls are estimates or reflect what larger populations happen to feel at that moment. But things can change a bit. Secondly, elections aren't census. They're not, because by virtue of the fact that you only have sort of 60% when you're talking high numbers of the community showing up, you're not reflecting the entire population. One of my theories is that, well, who are the African-American men that comprise that election stream in 2016? And it'll be the same question: who shows up and comprises the electorate in 2020? Is that electorate going to be one indication? Is that electorate going to be more people of color overall, and then among men? What are the ideals and thoughts that they bring to the election? It could have been African American men who were in military, maybe a little more conservative, who were supportive. If we're looking at exit polls, so I don't want to caution to say it's not true. It is. That these numbers reveal something. But I think we do have to drill down a little bit more into to Mr. Rodriguez's point. There is this appeal going on that might make these marginal increases, and marginal increases can make a difference.
And the only poll that matters is election day.
Always true.
It's the only one that matters.
Mr. Carter, do you think the Richland County Election Commission can do a better job in reaching out to Hispanics? And have you partnered with organizations such as Ms. Rodriguez Hodges in reaching out to the Hispanic community?
In terms of doing a better job, yes, we can. And as for partnering up with organizations, we haven't started partnering with organizations just yet, primarily because we have pretty much been in high gear for 2020, making sure everything is right in terms of machines, make sure absentee ballots go out. So as a result of actually doing like literal outreach towards organizations and doing partnerships with organizations, we haven't had the time just of yet. So hopefully once the election is passed, we can go back to actually establishing relationships, because currently, like say for example, in my case, I am, even though I'm the voter outreach coordinator, I do, like, because it's just me, I have to do a lot of this stuff on my own. And as a result, it ends up being a situation to where you combine the fact that I have to do a lot of this on my, shall we say, on my own, in conjunction with making sure that absentee stuff is in order, putting together outreach packets and stuff. So and then also COVID created a massive slowdown, because normally right around the time COVID hit, that would be around the time that I'll basically try to go out and start trying to connect with people in the community, try to basically get groups together. But pretty much, yeah, COVID and the preparation for 2020 has pretty much slowed a lot of that down. So,
yeah. Ms. Phillips, registering people for the census is like registering people to vote. Are there any, how should I say this? Are there any methods that you use relative to the census that can be employed in the Hispanic community or the African American community in terms of registering people to vote?
Yeah, so I think Brandon actually touched on it. It's one that after a certain point, we had to assess our own privilege in this moment and say, for those of us who are comfortable getting outside and being with community in a safe way, that we needed to do it. Because we knew that most of the time, the individuals who delay their response to the census are also the ones who also delay their voting, right? And registering to vote. So we coupled all of our outreach efforts with ensuring that we were registering people to vote at everything that when we were out in the community. And one of which of making sure that we had a genuine relationship with everyone, and then saying, if it's just 3 or 5 of us, then we can do so much more. But then really leveraging our relationships and partnerships. I think, Tanya, that happens because someone knew her. And then we had a call and we say, how do we ensure that the community gets these resources? Because we went to City Council for additional funds. And so really looking at each other and saying, in our strategy, we can have virtual options, phone banking, right? We did it on Zoom and we used breakout rooms. Then we said, all right, for people who feel comfortable going out, we can make sure we can be right there in the mix, knocking on doors, telling them to come out. And then we incentivized options to come to fill out your census. And then, hey, while you're here, because of course we can't incentivize you registering to vote, but while you're here, you can register to vote. So we tagged on to as many programs as we could, because we knew that, hey, it's just me, it's just 50 other folks from the city. And so we put out an ask. for more volunteers when we realized that many of our current folks said, we don't feel comfortable leaving the house. That's okay. You can do phone banking, but for those of you who wants to get in the streets, let's go. That's why I'm in my t-shirt right now. We just had a program today, and it's about going to the Section 8 housing, partnering with Columbia Housing. They're amazing. Using these relationships that we have and leveraging those partnerships are what makes it successful.
Let me throw this out to you, and I would like the panelists to address this. This is a very interesting statistic. $23 billion. Let me make sure I get this right. Non-white school districts receive $23 billion less in education than white school districts. And also Latinos don't vote because they aren't sought. And a lot of times Latinos feel that the system has failed them. Now, keeping that in mind, when you look at the Black Lives Matter movement and what's happening in Louisville right now, and you tell people, well, you can make a change by voting. A lot of people don't feel that way. And I'm just wondering, you talk about the power of the vote. Do people realize the power of the vote when you have statistics like I've just read and we see what's happening in Louisville? Do you think that people just say the system is just not going to work for me, so why should I go vote? And I'm gonna just throw that out. Dr. Shaw, you can take it, and panelists, go ahead.
Well,
Yeah, actually, I'll defer to Mr. Carroll Carter or Dr. Torres. So.
All right, Dr.
Yeah,
Torres?
well,
I think this go both ways. And I mentioned earlier that some populations feel disenfranchised and they don't have that need to vote. They don't think their vote counts. But I do believe that what is happening right now with Black Lives Matter and all the movement and all those killings of African Americans is making people think that they can change, that if they participate, they can change. If they vote, they can make a difference. But I do believe that both situations are happening right now.
Ms. Rodriguez, do you feel that Hispanics feel that their vote really doesn't matter? And do you think that hampers the power of the Hispanic vote, Ms. Rodriguez?
Well, I'm going to tell everybody to call me Tanya.
Okay.
Because my name is so long, Don. So you can call me Tanya. But here's what I know. I have Afro-Latino boys, men now. And I have a beautiful 30-year marriage to an awesome Black man that you know. And this movement has changed and pivoted our way of thinking and our civic engagement in our country. So we have done something in that we have been able to do a program in phases and distribute 20,000 PPE kits across the state to mostly Latinos, but to some, and this is how my husband says it, to Americans of African descent, because he doesn't like it the other way. And it has been an eye-opening experience because when we passed out, when we were doing the PPE kits that had gloves, masks, sanitizer, and handy wipes in them, we recognized the fact that they didn't understand anything about voting. So we handed out information about voting. We handed out information about census completion. And we talked about what was going to happen in November if they didn't vote. And I believe that we got the message across. And then we talked also about the uptick in the racial divide and what that meant. and that democracy is not a spectator sport. And so I think that we're making some type of an inroad, especially in our state. We have more work to be done. But here's the thing. Organizations, agencies, government bodies cannot go into our communities and shake a hand, kiss a baby, and say hello on a Monday, a Tuesday, and a Wednesday. And then they don't come back for a year. And then they do it again on a Friday, Saturday, or Sunday and believe that they're connecting with the community, because that's not how it works. It takes connection. It takes commitment. It takes dogged effort. It takes to the point where your feet hurt, your back hurts, your neck hurts, your head hurts, your fingers hurt, everything in your body hurts, and you know that tomorrow you still got to do it again. That's what it takes for the community to understand who you are, who your organization is, who you represent. They know your voice, they know your steps, they know everything about you, they know your smell. So that when you say this is a safe thing to do, that's good enough for them.
And
Let's talk.
trust.
Yes, go ahead.
It needs trust. Our population, we need trust. We need to trust the people that come to us.
Speaking about trust, what about the post? Yes, go ahead, Mr. Upson. You had a comment?
That was me. Yes, sir. I was going to ask, could you repeat the question? I wanted to address part of the question that you mentioned, sir.
I actually forgot what the question was, but it ties into this, and maybe you'll be the first one to answer this one. The post office and absentee mail-in balloting. Are you hearing some concerns about that?
Yes, sir. I am hearing concerns about it, and right now the discussion that is going on around the office is that in some cases the post office is we're being told that they're going to get back online and try to get everything in order. However, when it's coming to voter outreach and concerns that people have about absentee, I'm suggesting to people, like, I'll give you an example. So in terms of absentee, to go through the process of requesting a mail-in absentee ballot, you have to contact our office, go through the process of getting the absentee application form, sign it and date it, and then the absentee ballots will end up getting sent out on October 5th. Now, initially, before the House bill passed, the last day to request an absentee mail-in ballot was October 30th. And of course, the problem with that is the fact that from October 30th to November 2nd, the last day to vote absentee and to turn in absentee ballots, it was not that long of a time frame. So while the bill went ahead and pushed the last day to request absentee back to October 24th, I've been advising to people that if they are requesting a mail-in absentee ballot, that they go ahead and they do so now, and that they use the second week in October, the second full week, which will be the week of the 12th, as kind of a hard deadline to go ahead and request an absentee ballot. And the reason why I'm saying that is because while we're being told that, okay, that the post office is going to get back in order and that everything is going to run smoothly, of course, people have a legitimate reason to be distrustful of that. So as a result, I advise for people that if they're doing a mail-in absentee, that they go ahead and request now. And even if it's a situation where they don't know if they're gonna, like, I'll give you a perfect example where you have people that are saying, well, I'm on the fence about going to the polling location and actually voting absentee in person or staying home. In a situation like that, I still advise for them to go ahead, if they don't feel comfortable enough, to go ahead and request absentee now. So that way, even if it is a situation to where, okay, they say, well, I haven't got my absentee ballot yet, but I've filled out the mail-in application for it, well, you still can go and vote in person. But again, in terms of timeframes, to kind of basically summarize it and focus on the timeframes, even though they push back the timeframe to October 24th being the last day, I still advise that people go ahead and request mail-in absentee now, and that they use the full week in October as kind of a deadline. So that way there is enough of a space of time to receive their ballot in the mail, and either if they wish to mail it back, if they don't feel safe with any human interaction at all at this point, they can just mail it back and they'll still get back in a comfortable enough time to where it will be counted. Or if it's a situation to where they mail it, but they want someone to drop it off on their behalf, then they can go ahead and do so. So even though, like I said before, even though we're being told that, hey, stuff is going to smooth out, I'm still basically taking steps to say, hey, go ahead and take this care of this now and use these dates. Like, even though here's the official dates, use the second week in October. It's kind of a unofficial kind of deadline. So that way you have enough of a space to avoid any issues if they do occur.
Let me throw this out because I've discovered this today. 2 women, one is 93 and one is 91. And I told them they could vote absentee. They don't want to vote absentee. They said because of this controversy, they think the only way their vote will count is for them to actually show up at the polling place and vote.
And see, that's one of the misconceptions I had to spend a lot of time explaining. And
I could not talk to them and tell them they are, because of this controversy, they sincerely believe that if they don't show up at the polling place, their vote won't count.
And see, that's the sad part, because what I had to explain to people is that when it comes to the absentee mail-in ballots, believe it or not, on election day, they're the first totals that we actually tabulate. Because usually when we start tabulating the numbers on election day, which I want to say we start tabulating about 9, 10 o'clock in the morning, in some cases, the absentee ballots from the mail-in are often the first ones to go through. So when we start getting the initial totals at night, they're literally drawn from absentee and some of the fail-safe. But in the case of, and one of the issues that I'm finding, particularly with outreach, is that one of the things I have to end up combating a lot of is, shall we say, misinformation. And I think that's a perfect example of it, because people are saying, well, one of the things I heard that similar saying where people say, well, my vote won't count because it's going through the mail. Well, it still will count. One of the other things I was hearing too is that, well, if I do go and vote in person, then there's a concern about the machines being hacked and stuff. Well, the funny thing about our election machines, they're not connected to any internet. In fact, the machine we use to tabulate the votes is not even connected to any internet at all. So what I find that ends up happening is that in a lot of cases, it ends up being a case of people, or shall we say, sources that provide misinformation. And again, this is one of the things I try to do my best on in terms of providing information, like providing access to information, access to basically the election laws and everything else. But one of the things we end up encountering is misinformation, and some of that misinformation is born from the fact that when it comes to how elections work, a lot of people don't really know, or shall we say, weren't really educated about the intricacies of how elections work. So as a result, that allows for spaces where people can come in who they themselves may not even understand that much about elections, but they will say, well, see, if you do this, your vote won't count. And of course, in some situations, there are people that's on scene, that's on station, that be able to say, well, no, that doesn't make sense. And here are the laws that basically show that you're wrong. But in some cases, there's not anybody there to correct it, or it was a situation to where it's a partial truth. So as a result, the information just basically floods out there. And like, say, for example, I know by the time I started doing outreach in 2018, most of my early part in 2019 was out trying to correct misinformation that was spread as far back as 2013. So, like, in terms of when it comes to the voting element, I'm not gonna sit and say, everything's perfect, and like, no, like we strive to make sure that everything is perfect, but of course, us being human, I'll say perfect is something we strive for, but something that may be impossible to obtain. But at the same time, when it comes to like when it comes to basically providing information and stuff like that, in some cases, this is the advice I give people. If it's a situation to where someone gives you information and even if you cause it a question, then please either contact the office or just contact me personally, and I'll be more than happy to try to help guide people through and say, well, this is where they probably got this portion right, but this is the reality of it. So again, it ends up being a case of misinformation being spread, and like I said, people may not being able to understand, okay, well, this is the nuances of it in X, Y, and Z. So.
Yeah. Well, considering where the information is coming from these days, it is confusing. I'm kind of curious, Tanya and Dr. Torres, have you all heard any concerns, and does this controversy with the post office and absentee mail-in voting, what we are hearing, how is that being received in the Hispanic community? And is it driving down the vote, or is it increasing the vote?
I think like everybody else, the people I talk to, they want to go in person mostly because of what is happening, what is being said. And we have to remember too that in many cases, we have heard that Latinos who are not citizens are voting, and that resonates with us because it's not the case. People know exactly if they can or cannot vote, and they are not planning huge schemes to change elections. We want to do the right thing, but yes, this is resonating among us, and many of us just want to go to the poll and vote there because we don't know what's going to happen.
What about that, Ms. Rodriguez? Are you hearing the same thing?
It's, what we're hearing is it resonates the same, it's multiplied. Facebook is not our friend. Twitter is not our friend, but mostly it's Facebook. The misinformation is so thick that you can't even see the bottom of the pond. So, but everybody's in the pond and they're staying in the pond, even though they don't know what is in the murky water. So I don't understand it. However, they're in all the way in. They're neck in. And the misinformation is daunting. It's like an everyday thing that you have to combat the misinformation. And then you hope and pray that that continues to trickle down. And then, nope, the next day somebody else calls with, another crazy theory. And then you have to discount that one and put them on the right track. But it's hard. It's very difficult.
Let me, Don, if I can.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, let me just really quickly jump in. But there is some recent polling that suggested that there's a partisan divide in who's going to vote by mail. That Democratic voters or Democratic-leaning voters are much more likely than their Republican counterparts to want to vote by mail. And this will be, as we have this uncertainty about the elections and trust in the elections, and I'll say it in a nonpartisan fashion, but some of the information is being put out by political candidates. And so if we have these mail-in ballots sort of being tabulated at one point, and they look somewhat in contrast to what happens on the actual election day, are there ways in which there'll be some distrust sowed? Tallies might look, on November the 3rd, that the tally might be one thing. Then you count sort of these mail-in ballots. And again, Mr. Carter speaks to, the effort to do it right away. But you have these mail-in ballots sort of staggered in terms of their counting, and then the tally switches in another direction. So we got to get people used to the idea that this is not really election day. It's sort of election 2 months, and so just gear up populations to say, we may not know who are the winners on November 3rd or November 4th.
Mr. Upson,
Can
what
I
about
add,
you in terms of
Mr. Dunn?
what you do? How is this affecting your organization, this whole controversy of the post office and absentee mail-in voting? Mr. Upson?
Oh,
I think Mr. Upson.
yeah. Can you hear me? Was he talking to me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So first I want to talk about the misinformation is not just on the media and on Facebook and Twitter. It's actually reaching people's mailboxes right now. Last week, one of our volunteers received a postcard in the mail telling him that he was not eligible to vote in South Carolina. And it was just a random postcard, and it didn't even come from a place in South Carolina. So there's already voter misinformation tactics taking place in targeting key demographics. Now, when it comes down to people trusting the post office, just like everyone else said, most of the young folks that we're talking to are saying that they're going to, because even back early, we've been pushing people to request their absentee ballot. So now they are committed to, once they get it, to actually hand deliver it once they fill it out, because they don't trust putting it back in the mail and having it, vanish between their house and the polling place.
Ms. Phillips, talk about the misinformation that you had to deal with in terms of the census and how you've overcome it.
It was I think from the very beginning, one, especially as an immigrant, and then kind of talking about what does it mean for immigrants when filling out this form that maybe they do know about the census, and how individuals from the very start was, especially for the Hispanic and Latino population, saying that if you fill this out, something will happen to you, or if you fill this out, your information will be turned in. And something that Brandon mentioned that I think is also relevant here is that we can't negate the fact that misinformation was coming from people they should trust, right? Where things were coming in the mail that looked very, very official, asking for crazy information in addition to everything that the census would ask for. And then also kind of pulling on individuals to say, after you fill this out, somebody will come to you or your information will be sent off. And then we were out in the fields telling everybody, this will not happen, this will not happen. And then we found out that South Carolina turned in a lot of information right to the president himself. And so we had to kind of backpedal and kind of work toward the fact that what do we do when we're trying to tell them that this is the path forward, and then even from the very officials that we should be trusting, we're getting punched in the gut. Outreach changed. We told everybody we have until October 31st. That totally shifted. It ends this month. And so I think when we're talking about voters being apathetic or individuals not wanting to fill out their census, I would say that individuals are very smart. They pay attention to what is happening around them. It's their survival tactic. And so if you say it is safe to send it in the mail, but then I'm seeing mailboxes disappear, right?
Right.
I'm not going to trust that. I'm going to say, no, I need to be there because something's got to change, or this is the status quo and I'm not going to change, right? And so then it goes back to what Tanya says, where you have to be in the community constantly so they know I can trust this person. Because they're going to be here before, during, and after the election happens, because they care about me beyond my vote, because it's afterwards that they're going to pay attention. And so the census, it's more than that. It's always been bigger. And our strategy is we get the connection between this conversation and obviously Richland Library gets it too, and voting.
So how is the move from October to September going to affect the census, you think?
I chuckle because, sorry. It has shifted everything. I think it is. I'm a social worker at heart, and I've been trained, and so I have to look at it from a strength-based perspective, in the sense that I saw my community recognize the urgency in the now, right? Of where we were able to bust out 12 different in-person programs. You had various AC Flora High School doing. They knocked out in an hour 524 calls to community members telling them about the census, because they recognize that this is ending. So what does it mean for the numbers? I'm worried. I'm worried about individuals that look like me, that identify as immigrants, that exist within the margins, that are individuals experiencing poverty, because we're looking at self-response rates in a state that still struggles with internet connection, in a state that has low literacy rates, when we're saying we're expecting them to read all this information that we're sending out. And so it's multifaceted, and we're not going to be here all night, Dawn, but the hurdles prior to the reduced timeline was large and endless. And so they just added even more when they said, you know what, you have more time. Actually, you don't, on top of a global pandemic, on top of polarized communities, when talking about trying to make the census a partisan thing, when we know it's not. But because of the power that goes behind those numbers and what it means, and how individuals have used that to gerrymander their districts. So I think it causes so many different issues, but I'm excited for individuals who understand the urgency of telling everybody on this call watching should at least tell 10 people to fill out their census, and encourage others to do the same. That's the call to action right now. And then if they say they have, guess what? Have you registered to vote? It's a two-part question, or it's a two-part statement.
Dr. Shaw, speaking of the census, we know the census figures are used for reapportionment. Can you talk about the census and reapportionment and the power of the Black vote? How does that affect the Black vote and Hispanic vote?
Well, the short answer to the question is that the census is really kind of the basis for political fairness. That if we do not know what the population actually is, where people live, we can't draw political maps, electoral districts that actually reflect the population. And so if you have a miscount between how many people are actually in a county versus when members in the legislature and elsewhere go out and sit down and draw a map, then that can be a fundamental level of unfairness and inequality. So we already have this problem of gerrymandering. We already have this problem of elected officials selecting their electors, their voters, as opposed to voters selecting the elected officials. And these district lines already being drawn, as courts have already said, that you can have political biases. Parties can draw these lines, and in some ways then have votes be diluted in key ways. But having said that, there are all these other questions about, you threw out the figure in terms of education and educational appropriations, across the board. Again, being aware where people are, being aware of whether or not a county, a city, a hamlet is getting its fair share of these federal or state or local dollars, they all hinge upon a fair count. And so I would say, along with the great efforts of China Phillips and her organization, there are other organizations out there like the organization Fair Count, in part, I think, founded by Stacey Abrams in Georgia, that are trying to likewise get at this question of every citizen, or I should say, every resident of the United States and every voter. Critically important of counting all of those folks.
Ms. Phillips, let me just clear something up. The census is a count of everyone who is in the country every 10 years, not just American citizens. Is that correct?
Correct. Every single person staying or resting their head in the US more than 6 months out of the year, period. We want to count you because you're utilizing resources. And Dr. Shore mentioned work with Fair Count, who we got to partner with in their stop to South Carolina, along with E Pluribus Unum. And I encourage everyone on the 26th of this month, it's the Census Day of Action. And United Way has been doing a phenomenal job on leading a lot of work. And so it's a time for, if you haven't been involved or engaged, they have work in 20 different counties, more than 20 different counties. And so you can get involved to ensure that there's a fair count, to touch on everything that Dr. Shaw mentioned.
Ms. Rodriguez, if I can come to you, there are 32 million Hispanics who are eligible to vote. What is that figure in South Carolina? Does anybody know how many eligible Hispanics there are in South Carolina?
There were 88,000 in 2016. So probably more than 100,000.
We know for a fact that the last census was an incomplete census. We know for a fact here in Richland County, because we worked with Richland County on the last census. And at that point, it was, you know, other people that were in charge. And we came up with the definitive conclusion that there were many people that did not open doors because they were afraid. And I'm praying that this time around, because of the work that has been done, the footwork that has been done and laid prior to, we have people that have been filling out their census and completing the census for this count.
Mr. Carter, this is the question, the $24 question that's on everybody's mind. Is the Richland County Election Commission ready for November 3rd?
Yes, sir. We are ready for the. Sir?
I said you can assure us of that, right?
Yes, sir. I definitely can assure it, because otherwise, if I'll put it this way, if we weren't working towards the election, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in right now, where pretty much, because to be honest, whereas most of the county has been shut down since March, we have been working full time since April to make sure this election goes smoothly. We've been working full time since then. We've been trying to do our best to field calls, make sure forms get processed, you name it. So we pretty much been really preparing for this. Well, prepared this year since April, but really we started preparing for it really back in the latter half of 2019.
Now, there was a decision that came out from an appeals court today that basically said that if you are voting absentee, you do need a signature, right?
Last I checked when we had the discussion about that today, it was actually not the case. When the federal judge, Michelle Childs, made the decision, we were still waiting to see if the state was going to challenge it. But since the state didn't challenge it, people do not need a witness signature to go ahead and vote absentee.
Wasn't there appeals court?
Yeah, I think there was, right, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's changed. Yeah, it's changed today, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when is the last day to register to vote, Mr. Carter?
The last day to register in person will be October 2nd, and the last day to register online will be October 4th.
And if I have an absentee ballot, I have to either drop it in the mail or bring it to Richland County Election Commission, right? There's no drop boxes or anything you can drop them in.
Yes, sir. Sadly, we do not have any drop boxes, but you can either bring it to our office on 2020 Hampton Street or mail it. And then also you'll be able to bring it to the satellite locations too, which I think I saw in the PowerPoint. That was the older listing. They basically reduced it down to 6. So Eastover, and I think it was the north. It was a northern one, North Creek or something like that. Those have been basically canceled, but we still have the other 6 satellite locations up and running, sir.
So with the huge amount of absentee ballots coming in this year, will you be able to count all of those by 12 o'clock November 3rd?
Well, actually, when it comes to tallying those votes, we end up staying really till, in a lot of cases, till the next day, making sure the votes count. So, but really, we're gonna start trying to count those actually a little bit earlier. So
it'll be the next day, actually, right?
Well, officially, when it comes to the official totals, we don't release. We end up giving the unofficial results usually on the very next day, but the official results, we have to wait for the board to certify them on that Thursday.
We're talking about the power of the Black vote, and if you have a question, you can type it in our chat room. We have about 15 minutes left. But what should we know about the power of the Hispanic vote, Ms. Torres?
We are a powerful group. We are very diverse. We are contributing to the community we live in. We are very proud to be Americans. And we are voting.
Ms. Rodriguez, when you look at the Hispanic vote, it's basically concentrated in, I think, California, New York, Texas, and New Jersey. I think I may have left out a state. But how would you gauge that power here in South Carolina?
Well, being a former tri-stater, New Yorker, I think that we are gearing up to have a powerful footprint here as well. I think that that's evident with the number of people that have come through South Carolina, realizing that we do have a higher number than in the past. And that is why they are also speaking here. I have heard one too many holas on their campaigns stops here. And, but they're trying, right? Everybody is trying. And I'm not just talking about the presidential candidates, I'm talking about other candidates as well. But I think that one thing that Miriam left off is that we're very loyal. So I'd like to give an example. Everybody knows Goya. We use Goya because our parents, our mothers use Goya, our grandmothers use Goya. I use Goya because I couldn't tell you why I use Goya, because that's what we used. Then something happened and somebody put their foot in their mouth and they refused to take their foot out of their mouth. And then there was a revolt and we stopped using Goya. Now, to us, this was a huge deal, right? Because this is the only thing we know. So we had to pivot and get other products. Don, I'm telling you, this was traumatic. However, we stuck together and we made a point by saying, this will not go down in the Latino community. You will not say what you said to us in the Latino community. We will fight back with our almighty dollar. We may not be seen, but our dollars are felt in your pocketbook. So you cannot undercount what we will do at the voting booth, whether it be now or every 2 years. You have to recognize that we are a growing population and we're a growing voter bloc.
Mr. Upson, in your work, it's often said that the Black community is taken for granted. Why should we vote? One party takes us for granted, the other party don't care. How do you approach that in terms of trying to get people to recognize the power they have in the vote?
Yeah, and going back to, I just want to state a number. I just looked it up from our database, and I see that when you combine African American and Black voters with Latinx voters and Hispanic voters in South Carolina, that group together makes up 269,000 unregistered voters in South Carolina. And when we are registering people to vote, you know, we have to connect the dots to the solution, and the solution we see is voting and being part of the franchise. You know, if you're upset that, you know, your family is being, has suffered the loss of a loved one due to incarceration and over-policing, then there's a sheriff that's elected, there's a solicitor that's elected, and these people have the authority to impact your life in that way. If you're upset that you do not have the money in your pocket that you believe you should have, or the opportunity for good jobs then there are people who are elected to have the authority to bring those jobs to be. So we're always connected in a dot. And one of the latest things that we've been talking about is fatherhood rights and child support with our group. And all of this is just ways that we can, we have to address the elephant in the room that they use us. Some people say they pimp us for our vote and we don't see them again for another 2 to 4 years. But now we got to get to the nuts and bolts of what's happening in our community, in our pockets, and at our kitchen table. And that's the way that we get folks registered to vote. But that's how we have to move forward, because there's a big gap in our community as it comes to civic education and the understanding of, who's in charge or who has authority over which part of our lives and our livelihoods. So we have to continue to educate folks on that.
Dr. Shaw, one of the things people say in the Black community is that it's important to vote because our ancestors fought and died for us to get the right to vote. Well, you talk to a lot of young people today, that really doesn't matter. They just think that the vote is not that important because neither party cares. How is that addressed, and how does that dilute the power of the Black vote?
Well, actually, I've had a conversation with some younger African Americans, and I agree with the assessment to say that, yes, I'm in my 50s. And so, well, let's think about it. I was born in 1965. So I was born toward the end of the life of Martin Luther King and toward the end of the Civil Rights Movement. So I would agree that, yes, it is critically important. And that's not to in any way, shape, or form not to give due homage to John Lewis, to C.T. Vivian, to Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, all of these legendary individuals who literally put their lives and their livelihoods on the line to secure the vote, among other freedoms. But you do have to make a direct appeal to this generation, many of whom were born after 1990 or generations born after 1990. You have to talk about what they are confronting. You have to talk about the hopelessness and the fears and the frustrations. We just had this case with regards to Breonna Taylor, among others. The frustrations that individuals are feeling about what's happening around policing and racial justice. And you have to have candidates that also speak to those frustrations. I think some of what I would like to have that conversation about is not to, as I say to others, don't talk at the younger generation, have a conversation with them. Have a conversation about the importance of voting. Have a little information on your side about how it isn't critically important, about issues that actually affect their lives, but then also hear about the issues that they want to speak to. And so I agree with that assessment, Don, that we can pay homage to ancestors, but we cannot sort of rest on laurels and think that history alone is going to compel individuals to get out to vote. It is an issue of what have you done for me lately, because they have to cast votes in real time for real candidates on real issues.
And can I say this, Mr. Don?
Mm-hmm.
When the group that we target, and just so you know, my group targets African American and Black men under the age of 55, and our largest group is between the ages of 16 and 35. And we're targeting 16-year-olds because in 2 years during the midterms, they're going to be eligible to vote. So we want to engage them now and get them in the habit of keeping up with this and learning about the process itself. But what we're finding is for a group between 18 and 25-ish, when you say someone fought and died for your right to this, that really irritates them. And it actually it counters what you're trying to achieve with getting them involved. And literally, just like what the doctor said, you have to talk about what they are facing right now. And that's different from state to state, from city to city, and even from high school to high school. But you have to connect the dots between the issues, the real life issues, and not try to bring up the past of what folks have sacrificed to do this, because that demographic there really doesn't like it. And I'm on the tail end of the millennials. I was born in 85. And, you know, it's been a learning curve even for me, because my younger brothers and sisters are, you know, in their 20s. And sometimes I have to look and say, what in the world? Like, you know, but luckily our team consists of young people from all over the South, and they help us connect those dots. One of the things that we've done, and it showed me exactly how you can be within a generational group and not really get the other side of that. We did a text messaging program where we tried to figure out what would get people involved. And we just changed the first greeting from, you know, hi, how are you doing? Or hi, this is blank, blank, blank from Amplify Action, to saying, hey, young king, this is Brandon with Amplify Action. And just changing it and acknowledging their glory really got the highest response, almost 2 to 1 from what we were doing before. And it's small things like that that can make a difference, but they have to, you just have to make the effort to figure out how to engage this generation and get them involved.
Can I add on to that as well?
Yes, go ahead.
So one of the things that I found help when it came to voter registration, particularly with young Black men, and heck, even with myself, because I'm technically a millennial because I was born in '94. Like, it's basic. One of the issues that came up with the narrative of where people say, "Oh, well, your ancestors fought and died for the right to vote," is that in addition to what Dr. Shaw said before, it ends up being a case to where, like, it ends up being a case to where when you put, like, I'll put it this way, it's a combination of, oh man, I just blanked that. I apologize, y'all, but basically, when it comes down to it, you have to basically, I'll put it this way. When it comes to young folks and voting, a lot of young folks have gotten to the point, particularly the young folks, a lot of them I encountered, they saw more action through advocacy on the street, advocacy on the ground than they have through voting. So in order to close that gap, you have to end up connecting the two together. So you have to basically say, like, you have to basically, because the problem with saying that the elders died for us the right to vote, for the past, like, I'll put it this way. It ends up being a situation to, yes, they died to the right to vote, but it was also a lot of advocacy involved to getting that vote, and then advocacy involved even after the vote to advocate for specific community issues. So it ends up being the same now, to where when you talk to a young person, say, well, oh, the elders died for the right to vote. It's like, well, I remember it actually came up at one of the outreach events I had a while back. It said, okay, yeah, they died for us the right to vote, but if it took us going, because somebody brought up the point, say it took us getting out into the street after George Floyd got killed for people to start trying to actually hear the narratives of Black Americans, or try to actually launch efforts to either recruit more Black Americans into jobs and stuff like that. So in order to get younger folks more energized about voting, you have to basically say, well, yes, voting is a crucial tool of advocacy, but it's a crucial tool, but it's a part of the grander scheme of community advocacy. And when you put it that way, it makes it easier for people to say, okay, well, you know what, I can get down with voting, because it still ends up being a case to where, yeah, we vote, but if these people do not do what they promised to do for us, then we're going to be on them. We're going to be at their locations and stuff. So that's the way you get young folks energized about voting. But when you just come in and say, well, oh, the ancestors died for the right to vote, because that's another thing. Young folks, I think that the thing is that we tend to assume that young folks don't really study history. And while they may not be hardcore historians like me, where they're going out and studying, like, oh, this is obscure Black unit in World War II, but they have a basic understanding to it and say, well, yeah, ancestors did die for voting, but there's other elements to it. Because again, thanks to technology, we're able to do research at the drop of a dime for certain things. So yeah, my point is that when it comes to getting young folks to vote, you can bring up the ancestors died for, but it's a tactful way of doing it, and then connecting it to community advocacy to help encourage. But when you just say, oh, ancestors died for it, that ends up being an immediate turnoff.
Let me raise this question. We have a question from someone who is zooming in, and I'll throw this out to you, Ms. Rodriguez, Dr. Shaw, or Ms. Torres, I'm gonna throw it out to the three of y'all. For people outside of the Black and Latinx communities who want to support those communities, what are the most critical issues that we should pay attention to when casting our vote?
For me, it would be, yeah, for me, it would be immigration, and who's going to do something about immigration reform. We still have children in cages. We still have children wrapped in essentially tinfoil. We still have separation at the border, children from their parents. I know that we have forgotten, many people have forgotten about that, but that is still happening. Secondly, I would say that we need to do something about the process of speeding up, having the paperwork accessed and getting people, Dr. Torres, help me with the,
the path to citizenship.
Path to citizenship, because we are averaging between 5 to 7 years behind. So a lot of people say, oh, you don't belong here, you need to get your paperwork. But the problem is that their paperwork is submitted and they're waiting years before they are able to actually be seen in front of somebody to get that paperwork processed. And in the interim of waiting, they are in flux and their children are panicked that they could be picked up and then sent back to a country that they don't even recognize or know anymore. Dr. Torres, Dr. Shaw?
Yeah, I would like to add also that people keep saying, go to the end of the line, and in many cases there is no line. So understand the situation of the families, and that we are not criminals or rapists, or we are not here to hurt communities. We are here because we want the best for our families.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw. You have any thoughts on that as we wind down?
Yes, I think we have to see the issues of, we see the issues connected, interconnected. So it's not just a matter that we say, well, how can I, if I'm not African American or Latino, Latina, Latinx, how can I support this community? See those issues directly as your own. As Tanya has said, with regards to that issue of essential workers, where you're talking about African Americans and Latino, working class individuals who are the individuals, attending to hospital beds, who are critically important as part of the grocery workers, who are part of the food processing plants. Those essential workers and their issues are the issues of the nation. And so it's not, is it my issue or not, is it my issue or your issue if COVID-19 affects, and it does, Hispanic or Latino populations and African American populations at much higher rates and higher rates of mortality. Is that just a Black issue? Is that just a Latino issue? No, that's an American issue that affects American families across the board. Voting rights and civil rights are also those issues are critically important, because the fairness not guaranteed to the votes being lost in this county can have an impact upon the fairness and how these lines are drawn for others. And our party politics don't fall only along racial lines. So there are white Democrats who can be affected by these issues of misappropriation and gerrymandering in these districts, as is true for others. So I'm just sort of saying that there are critical issues in the African American community. Racial justice and policing is a fundamental issue that speaks to this issue of systemic racism. And I suspect why so many Americans, possibly 30 million Americans, got into the streets across racial and ethnic groups is because they saw, yes, Black Lives Matter, and we are all in that sense racialized in such a way when our Black brothers and sisters, and I should say brown brothers and sisters, are so disproportionately killed at the hands of police that it affects the quality of life and justice for us all.
Mr. Upson, final word from you on that question.
Yeah, and can you repeat the question for me, please?
The question is, are there issues that people outside of the community should be concerned with that would directly affect the Hispanic and African American communities?
Yeah, absolutely. And part of the reason why we chose to focus on African American man is because the African American man, in my opinion, is one of the most targeted demographics in America. And if we could restore power in that part of our community, then every other marginalized demographic in our state and in the South could have greater access to restoring power in their parts of our community as well. So just thinking about that alone, part of what we want to focus on when it comes to issues that impact us all is quality of life issues. You know, whether you can have access to quality education, quality job, and also be able to live safe and not expect to be thrown in jail or over incarcerated just because of the color of your skin or the community that you live in. One of the things that I saw in the chat here, someone was asking about felons. We have a large community of folks with criminal records who are Black, African American, Latinx people in South Carolina, over proportionate compared to any other demographic in our state. 2 weeks ago, we did a voter registration drive in Denmark, South Carolina. And I met this guy. He was about 60 years old. His name was George Washington. And he was arrested and got a felony about 20 years ago. And he's been done with parole and all his fines for over 10 years and did not know that he was now eligible to vote again. He regained his right to the franchise. And that is something that a lot of people don't know. We even met a young guy who had a misdemeanor and thought because he went to jail for that crime that he was no longer eligible to vote. But the reality is, if you have done your time, you're no longer on probation or parole, and you've paid all your fines, that you are now eligible to vote. And all you need to do is get your application for your registration form, fill it in and turn it in, and you'll be able to vote. But livability issues, we all should be able to live out the promise of America and be treated as first-class citizens.
Ms. Phillips, your closing thoughts. We are running toward the finish line with the census. What do you want people to know?
I want people to simply fill out their census. My2020census.gov, 1-844-330-2020. And then when they're done with that, of course, register to vote. September 26th, as I stated before, is our South Carolina Census Day of Action, and get connected with work going on right there in your community. They need your help. They need volunteers. You can follow or get connected if you go to SC Counts 2020. So that's my plug.
All right, Mr. Carter, you have the last word. Of course, there's power when you exercise the vote. So when do the polling places open?
Well, the satellite locations,
early voting.
The satellite locations, they actually open October 7th. Absentee voting starts on October 5th, and the satellites open up October 7th, and they'll last till November 2nd. And then, of course, on Election Day, November 3rd, people will be able to go to their polls and vote. Now, one of the things I like to emphasize is that when November 3rd comes, the main office is really more so a troubleshooting office. So when it comes to voting on Election Day, people have to go to their assigned polls to vote. But when it comes to the absentee period from October 5th to November 2nd, they either can go to our office on 2020 Hampton Street, and then once October 7th hit, they can either go to Garners Ferry Adult Activity Center, Park Lane, Ballantyne, North Springs Community Park Center, as well as the Masonic Temple. I want to say the ones that were, there was initially, I think it was Eastover, there was another location, but those got canceled. So, but I know I'm basically trying to put that information in the chat as well. So
All right, and so it's still time to register to vote. I want to make sure we'll get that in before we let you go.
Yes, sir. That's correct, sir.
All right, panel, it's been a very interesting conversation on the power of the vote, and to all of those who are tuning in, we certainly hope you exercise that power and you go to the polls and vote. Vote early, but don't vote often. You can only vote once. Thank all of you for joining me on this panel. It's been very interesting, and I hope that people took something or will take something away from this conversation. Thank all of you. And we also want to thank the Richland County Public Library for putting on this event. Good night.
Thank you, everybody. You have a good night.
And thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night,
Good night,
everyone.
everyone.
Pleasure.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.